Josephine Klein was a 15-year-old girl who lived in Jacksonville, Florida with her parents. Josephine was a shy and quiet girl. Growing up, she never made any real friends. Josephine had always preferred the company of her dolls when she was younger, and when she grew up, she stayed alone in her room reading a book or crafting a new art project in her room. Josephine's parents recently told her that they would be moving to Beaufort, South Carolina, where they had bought a large house. Her parents told her that it was a beach house. There was a large backyard with a tree, and not too far walking down was the cliffside that overlooked the ocean. Since Josephine had been living in Florida most of her life, her parents were a little concerned about the big change, but they hoped eventually Josephine would enjoy the new home. Josephine, however, didn't have a hard time saying goodbye to her old neighborhood and all the people she grew up with there. And it wasn't before long that Josephine did indeed love the house she moved to. The houses in the area were all pretty isolated, and there weren't any other boys and girls near Josephine's age living nearby that she could converse with. Having nobody to spend time with, Josephine became even more withdrawn and lonely, but things still looked positive. At first, she spent a lot of time in the backyard where she discovered a treehouse on top of the huge oak tree built by one of the previous owners. Josephine started to spend most of her time in the treehouse. Josephine's parents weren't too worried for their daughter anymore, or at least not until Josephine started to spend too much time in the treehouse, that her mother rarely saw her in the house anymore. That's when Josephine's mother, Mrs. Klein, started complaining to her husband that Josephine spent too much time in the backyard. It wasn't just a few hours in the morning or evening, but Josephine sometimes even skipped out on lunch or came late for dinner. Mrs. Klein couldn't stop mentioning the time when she had invited some new friends over for lunch. They were all excited to meet the family, but Josephine would rather not stay and introduce herself to the guests. She spent the whole afternoon out in the treehouse doing who knows what. Mrs. Klein didn't like how impolite her daughter had been to the guests. Out of curiosity, Mrs. Klein had even visited the treehouse herself, but it was empty. It seemed as if Josephine just sat there the whole time. Sometimes Mrs. Klein did spot her leave the house with her journal. Mrs. Klein wanted to take Josephine out shopping at the mall or have a mom and daughter day at the spa, but Josephine chose to stay back home, and Mrs. Klein always knew what, or rather where her daughter had been the hours she had been out of the house. "Josephine, don't you think you should spend more time outside? I'm going to a cooking class today. Maybe you might like some of the people there. Why don't you come with me?" "No, Mom, I'm fine at home." It was when things were going a bit over the line, and Josephine had started to misbehave with Mrs. Klein about going out to the treehouse, that she thought it was time to have a talk with her daughter. "Listen, Josephine, I don't want you to spend so much time in the treehouse anymore. From now on, I think it'll be better if you spend more time in the house, or maybe even by the beach shore." But it seemed as if Josephine had paid no heed to her mother, even when she had sternly told her not to go. Josephine disobeyed her mother and stayed in the treehouse when she wanted and for however long she wanted. One of these days, Mrs. Klein woke up and prepared breakfast for the family as she usually did. Once Mrs. Klein was done with her morning routine, she went around the house and woke up everyone from sleep. But on that bright, sunny morning, when she stepped into Josephine's room and drew her curtains, she saw her daughter wasn't in her bed. Mrs. Klein peeked into the bathroom and went around the house, but Josephine was nowhere to be seen. Of course, Mrs. Klein had come to the conclusion that Josephine was in the treehouse, but she didn't expect her daughter to wake up so early to go there. Mrs. Klein rushed to the backyard and climbed up the ladder. She found her daughter curled up inside the treehouse, sleeping. Josephine must have sneaked out of the house after dinner and hadn't returned. She dozed off out here. Mrs. Klein didn't confront her daughter at first, but when Josephine repeatedly spent the night and began sleeping out in the treehouse, Mrs. Klein thought it was necessary for Josephine's father to get involved. Mr. Klein thought his wife was being too strict on his daughter, but one morning, when he noticed the dark circles under Josephine's eyes, he realized perhaps things were getting a bit out of hand, and his daughter's behavior wasn't normal. "Josephine, this has went on long enough. You're not allowed to go to the treehouse." "But Dad, I didn't do anything. You can't do this. Please let me go." "I don't want to hear anything on this matter again." Mr. Klein kept an eye on his daughter and made sure she didn't go to the treehouse, and Josephine didn't disobey her father after his strict warning. But her parents had noticed a change in their daughter over the next few days that she was spending at home. Josephine spent most of her time near the window now that faced the treehouse in the backyard. She held the glass and longed to go out. Josephine looked miserable. But her parents assumed she would soon get over it and she would move on to something different. Days were going by like this, and Josephine looked disheartened. One night, at around 1 a.m., Mrs. and Mr. Klein woke up to a noise outside in the drawing room. Mrs. Klein had supposed a robber had broken into the home. Mr. Klein sneaked out of his room to see what was the noise about. He caught a glimpse of his daughter walking down the hallway. "Josephine, what are you doing up in this hour?" Josephine didn't respond to her father. After calling out to his daughter a few times, Mr. Klein realized Josephine was sleepwalking. When Josephine unlocked the back door to the house and walked out onto the backyard, Mr. Klein decided to follow his daughter and see where she would go. Josephine walked towards the treehouse. Mr. Klein was sure that's where she was headed. But when Josephine passed the treehouse and walked out onto the path that led to the cliffside, Mr. Klein became curious as to what his daughter was doing. He followed his daughter and watched as she reached the cliffside. But to his shock, his daughter wasn't stopping. Mr. Klein had realized Josephine intended to jump off the cliff. There was nothing but the hard rocks and the cold ocean waves beneath. Mr. Klein sprang to action and ran to save his daughter. Just within time, he grabbed hold of his daughter's hand and caught her fall. Josephine was still drowsy in her sleep. She wasn't in a state to speak. Mr. Klein didn't want to believe what would have happened if he hadn't woken up to spot Josephine leaving. He held his daughter and walked back home, where Josephine went back to bed. Mr. Klein told his wife to keep a good eye on Josephine at all times. He couldn't risk another chance keeping Josephine on her own. Mr. Klein couldn't sleep that night. He tossed from side to side, wondering why his daughter would want to end her life. What was it that was bothering her? Why was she so depressed? He could only come to one conclusion. Ever since he disallowed his daughter to go to the treehouse, her strange behavior and abnormalities increased. The next morning, Mr. Klein went out to his garden shed and picked up his axe. He was determined to take down the treehouse. He was worried for his daughter's life and her well-being. If this treehouse was the root to all problems, it had to go. Mr. Klein climbed the treehouse and inspected it. There was nothing inside. It was a small wooden room that viewed the ocean. He climbed back down and began chopping the tree trunk. After a while of chopping the trunk, Mr. Klein was surprised to find out a portion of the trunk under the bark was hollowed out. He dropped his axe and looked into the hollow space. And what he saw made him petrified. There, inside the hollow trunk of the tree, was the remains of an individual. Mr. Klein stumbled back on the ground. After bringing himself to his senses, he ran back to the house and called the police. Mrs. Klein was worried when she saw the look on her husband's face. "What's wrong? Why are you calling the police?" But Mr. Klein couldn't explain what he had just seen. The police arrived soon, and after hearing out Mr. Klein, began to investigate the contents inside the tree trunk. Mr. and Mrs. Klein watched the police crew take out skeletal remains. Josephine stood beside her parents and watched while tears rolled down her cheek. After a week-long investigation, the police informed the Klein family that they had discovered the remains of a young man named Adrian Emmerich, who had gone missing from this town many years ago. The police had come to the conclusion that someone had taken his life and hid his remains in the hollow trunk of the tree. The police had gotten some insight on the case after long years, but it was yet to be solved. After the backyard was cleared out and the tree had been chopped down, Mr. and Mrs. Klein had gotten some peace of mind, but Josephine seemed like she was recovering from her depression and unusual behavior. But every now and then, she still goes out to where the tree had been and scribbles something down in her journal. Josephine was looking out the treehouse window and watching the waves crash onto the shore. Suddenly, she heard a voice from behind her. "Hi." Startled, Josephine turned and saw a young man sitting behind her. She was frightened. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "Don't be scared. I mean no harm. My name is Adrian." The young man held out his hand, but when Josephine went to shake it, her hands passed through his. Bewildered, Josephine asked, "What are you?" Josephine's new companion amazed her, and she looked forward to meeting him. "Are you new here?" "Yes, I moved here with my family a few weeks ago. What about you?" "Well, you can say this place is like home to me." Josephine began spending hours in the treehouse every day, talking to Adrian. She liked spending time with him. "Josephine, you're here at this hour?" "I was missing you, so I sneaked out of the house. Everyone is sleeping." "When I talk to you, I feel like all my pain suddenly goes away." "Me too, Adrian. I think I've fallen in love with you." "Josephine, this has went on long enough. You're not allowed to go to the treehouse." "But Dad, I didn't do anything. You can't do this. Please let me go." "I don't want to hear anything on this matter again." "If you love me, you would listen to me, Josephine. Nothing will be able to separate us. Meet me at the cliff. We can be together forever." "Come on, Josephine. We'll finally be together forever. The pain will be over in a matter of minutes. Leap into the waters, Josephine. Leap into the waters and come to me." Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.